Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today at the Hungry Trout Resort and Restaurant in beautiful Wilmington, New York. And today we will be doing a beautiful wine tasting, and I'd like to introduce the staff to you. This is my husband, Terry Robards.
I'm part of the staff.
Terry started his store in Lake Placid in 1988. Prior to that, he worked as a career journalist all of his life. He was a foreign correspondent for the New York Times in London. While he was there, he began doing research and writing the New York Times Book of Wines, which you see right here. Upon returning to the United States, he became the wine columnist for the New York Times, and then from that point on, he was a columnist for Wine Enthusiast, Wine Spectator, and many of the airline magazines and other food magazines like Bon Appetit. He was the first columnist for them. He later went on to be the senior managing editor at Wine Enthusiast, and in 2012 he was inducted into the Wine Writers Hall of Fame in New York City, along with Eric Asmoff, who is the current New York Times wine critic. Terry is going to talk to us a little bit about what my son Timothy Robinson is about to do.
Great. Hello, everyone. I was asked to demonstrate the art of sabrage, which is removing the cork from a bottle of champagne or sparkling wine using a knife traditionally or some type of blunt object.
It's called sabrage because traditionally it was done with a saber.
With a saber. And you can, we've expanded on a lot of different items to use while taking tops off of bottles. So it's very important to note the fermentation that happens if you're going to be trying this technique. Ideally, you would want to use a true champagne, method champenois, method traditionnel, or even a Spanish cava or cremant. This is where the fermentation happens inside the bottle and gives a lot of pressure within here. What you wouldn't want to use as one of your first options would be Prosecco or something that's done in the Charmat method, a different way of getting bubbles into the bottle. These are very thick bottles to hold a lot of pressure, and for today we're going to be using a very old knife. This has a lot of history to it. This was attached to a bottle of champagne that was given to Terry and is still sitting down in the wine cellar. The other thing about the history of this knife is that it's very dull. You don't necessarily need to have a sharp blade to take the top off. We are just going to be removing the cork, sliding along the bottle, and striking at the weakest point of the bottle, and it's going to fly right off. Now, for this demonstration, we're going to be using Method Traditionnel France sparkling wine, Saint Hilaire. The first thing to do is make sure that you get it ice cold. This has been in ice for quite a while today, and that's going to definitely help with this technique. The other thing is to make sure that the neck is clear of any debris, and then we find the seam that is on the bottle by holding it up to the light and locating the seam. Where do we find that? Right along here.
There you go.
All right, so when we're holding this along the side, ideally you would want to have this done outside, but professionals come prepared. This is an actual sabrage card. I bought it from Italy, and it's meant for taking off the tops of champagne bottles. But it has this really neat chain that comes with it, and we are going to remove the top a little to the first lip, and then reattach the chain. The important thing to know is that when you do remove the basket, this is like cocking on a gun. It is locked and loaded. Terry once told me that the majority of emergency room visits on New Year's Eve are due to eye injuries. So think about
flying
that.
Corks.
Flying
People
corks.
opening the bottle, looking right down at the cork.
You sure that's on there? Good
That is
enough?
on there. It's gonna.
Okay.
Definitely
Now,
go on.
there's 90 pounds of pressure inside a bottle of champagne or sparkling wine that's been made in the traditional method, which we will go into. And so you want to make sure that when you're doing the sabrage technique, you do it outside if you don't have an attachment like Tim does, because that thing is going to fly. It would put out one of these windows otherwise. So He's found the seam.
So we get it ice cold, and again, you just keep contact down onto the neck of the bottle, follow through, and you have a little bit of spill. And what this does is it removes, with a very clean break, the cork still attached to the glass. Pretty neat. Fun little parlor trick.
In order to flatter Helen of Troy hundreds of years ago, this glass was developed, and it was said to be in the shape of her breasts. It does two things negatively to champagne. It causes the grapes to dissipate, and that's why you have champagne, is the bubbles, that's why you have champagne. And two, it causes the chillness of the champagne to dissipate, and the wine warms up. You don't want either of those to happen. Therefore, you should use either the tulip or the flute. The visual part of tasting wine is very important. It's part of your enjoyment. You need to watch those bubbles rising inside the glass. The classic champagne flute.
Now what you will notice about this wine is that the bubbles are making a little string of pearls. That's what they call it, string of pearls. So as your sparkling wine is poured, the carbon dioxide, which is in the solution, that's what creates the pressure in the bottle when you sabrage the top. That gets released, and it finds little spots in the glass where it can attach to. You'll notice that they just start from one place and go up. So the name of that, the romantic name of that, is the rosary or the string of pearls. When it comes to tasting sparkling wine, you do not have to do the traditional swirling and look. You look at it, that's all. You don't have to swirl it because it's already releasing its aroma into the bowl of the glass. So when it comes to tasting champagne, you want to first look at it, then give it a good smell. As the bubbles rise, they bring the aroma right up to your nose, and then you'll taste it. And you'll notice when it's in your mouth, it foams a little bit. When the glass of wine was poured, you notice that it created a foam on the top. You don't have it in this, but when Tim poured it for Terry's glass, it bubbled right up. That foam is called a mousse. And so there are lots of wonderful things going on in this for a professional wine taster. You've got the proper type of glassware. You have the ability to look at the wine and see the color, to check out the bubbles. These are nice fine bubbles because this was fermented in the bottle. If you have a Prosecco, which is a sparkling wine from Italy, you will notice that the bubbles are much larger. And then if you have a wine like Andre Champagne from California, you will notice that the bubbles are like the bubbles in Coca-Cola. So the size of the bubbles has a lot to do with the longevity of the wine in your glass, the aroma, and the flavor. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the wine that you have in your glass right now. It is not a champagne. It is a wine that originated in the southern region of France, in the Languedoc, and it started being made in 1531 by the monks at the Saint-Hilaire Abbey. And on the label, you will see it says Saint-Hilaire Blanquette de l'Amour. So Blanquette is the type of wine, grape. It is also called Mauzac. De l'Amour means of Lamoux, which is the region. And so what happened is these monks were making wine for the sacraments. That's what monks did. They would make wines for the church. And so the church is greatly responsible for the wine culture that we have today. And they would make their wines from the grapes that they grew in their vineyards of Mauzac. And in the harvest, they would, which was usually in early September, they would bring the grapes in, they would crush them in a gigantic wooden wine press that all the monks would push and they'd walk around. And the juice would come out. They would then take that clear juice and they would let it sit. On the grapes, as they were brought in from the vineyards, there was natural yeast. As a matter of fact, there are over 1,200 different strains of yeast in the world. They're all natural. They live on everything. They live in our bodies. They live on plants and trees. And so natural yeasts were on these grapes as they were brought in. Now the grapes are rich in sugar. They're twice as rich in sugar as the table grapes that we buy at the supermarket. Yeast, which is a single cell living organism, thrives on sugar. The type of yeast that thrives on sugar that's used in baking and in brewing and in winemaking is called Saccharomyces. It's the strain of yeast that eats sugar. So sugar-rich juice in the grapes, the yeast will get to work metabolizing that sugar. So for every single molecule of sugar in the grape juice, the yeast will metabolize it and give off 2 molecules of carbon dioxide and 2 molecules of alcohol. The yeast will live in that juice and convert all of the sugar that they can into alcohol, and as they do that, the yeast reproduce. So pretty soon, you've got a whole lot of yeast, and they're all contending for the sugar, and the alcohol is rising. The yeast doesn't have enough food. The alcohol ends up poisoning the yeast. When it gets to about 12 to 14%, the yeast die, and they settle to the bottom of the tank. The wine then is totally fermented, and it goes into a bottle or a vat, and in the case of the monks, it went into a barrel, and it ages over the course of the winter. I have here a fermenting bottle of white grape juice that I added some bread yeast to this morning, and you can see it's very cloudy. You can also see that there's some foam up here at the top, and you can see this balloon that has inflated. This is an example of how yeast converts the sugar into alcohol. And if you were to come over here and look at this, you would be able to see that it is just churning in there, and these bubbles are rising. Those bubbles are carbon dioxide. As the yeast consumes the sugar, it gives off those 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. Now, I put a whole packet of bread yeast in this thing, so they're really working hard, and the carbon dioxide ends up being trapped in the balloon. But this is an example of the carbon dioxide being captured. In a sparkling wine, they do pretty much the same thing that I did. They would put the wine into a bottle, and they would put the bottle into storage, and when it's cold, the yeast goes dormant. You know this because if you buy frozen bread dough at the grocery store, it's hard, it stays small. When you let it thaw and it warms up, it begins to expand. That's because the yeast is eating the sugar in the bread dough and creating carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide makes the bread dough grow, makes it, so when you take a bite of bread, you'll see that there are little bubbles inside, and that's from the carbon dioxide. It helps things to rise. So the monks would make their wine, and they would put it in bottles and put them in their cellar. This is 1531 this was going on. And of course, after the wine was made and put in bottles into the cellar, it got cold because it was wintertime. So what did the yeast do? It went dormant. And as it went dormant, it stopped the fermentation process. It hadn't all died off. The yeast goes to sleep over a couple of months, and then in the spring, when the weather warms up, the yeast rejuvenates and it starts to work again. And any sugar that's left inside of that bottle will be converted into alcohol, and the carbon dioxide is trapped inside the bottle. What was happening in the cellars is the bottles, which were not as thick as they are today, they were just hand-blown bottles of thin glass. The yeast created so much carbon dioxide that the bottle would explode. When the bottle exploded, it would set off a chain reaction, and bottles would explode all over the cellar. The problem was so intense that they started making themselves iron masks to wear, to protect themselves from shards of glass and flying wine. So the monks didn't understand what fermentation was, so they decided to relate it to the religion. So if God wanted them to have sparkly wine, then it was, blessed if it stayed in the bottles. But if the bottles exploded, then it was the devil's wine, and it was the devil's work. That wine was not going to be good, so that's why it exploded. But so many bottles were exploding that that was a big problem, and they had to figure out how to counteract that. So from 1531, this Blanquette de la Mode has been made continually. This was the first sparkling wine, and that's why we're kicking off this tasting with this. It has a much richer history than champagne. Now we're going to move on to champagne. This, incidentally, is $15 or $16 a bottle. This bottle here is a bottle of Dom Perignon Vintage 2010. So who was Dom Perignon? Well, Dom Perignon was a monk, a young monk. He was in his 20s, and he was working at a monastery in the Jura region of France, which is the eastern region of France, northeastern region of France. And there was a monastery a little ways away in the Champagne region. And they were having such a problem with exploding bottles that they got Dom Pierre Perignon, that his first name was Pierre. Dom is a title like father. And so Dom, when he was just 26 years old, he went to Champagne to the Abbey Auvillers, and he became their cellar master and keeper of the vineyards. He was just a young man. His whole aim was to improve the sparkling wines of Champagne. And so he came up with the idea of blending the still wine that was going to go into the bottles. And he decreed that all the wines made in the Champagne district would be made out of 3 different grape varieties. Those grape varieties are Pinot Noir, which is a red grape, Chardonnay, which is a white grape, and another red grape called Pinot Meunier. So he was the one that came up with the recipe for champagne. And today, any wine that you get from the Champagne region is going to be made from only those 3 grape varieties. Others are not allowed. And in France, you're not allowed to call any sparkling wine made outside of Champagne, champagne. The other words for sparkling wine is a crémant or sparkling wine. So anything that you see that says crémant on it, crémant d'Alsace, let's see. This here is a Blanc de Blanc, and it is made in the traditional method by a man named Francois Montand. And he was actually a Champagne winemaker in the early 1900s. And when war started, he took some of his vines and he escaped to the Jura, and he started planting vineyards with his Champagne grapes in the Jura. Today, this wine that is being produced in the method traditionnelle, or the method champenois, which is the method of doing the second fermentation in the bottle, that is $15 a bottle. It's made with grapes from the Champagne region, and it's made in the Champagne style. So you can pay for Dom Perignon at $280 a bottle, or you can get wine from the Jura, wine made by Francois Montand, who was from a family of Champagne winemakers, for a fraction of the cost. And the quality is amazing. Back to Dom, Pierre Perignon. Dom Perignon was instrumental in creating the blend that would go into Champagne. He was the first winemaker to actually make any blends, and he helped to create the thicker bottle. He introduced the cork as a closure, and the vineyards at Auvillers doubled in size. So his contributions to Champagne made him very, very famous. And now we go to Veuve Clicquot, which is about the third of a cost of a bottle of Dom Perignon. And Veuve in French means widow. So this is a wine that has the name of the first woman winemaker in history. Her name was Barbe Nicole Ponsardin Clicquot. She was the daughter of a wealthy textile merchant in Champagne, the city of Reims. And she was arranged in marriage to the son of a wine merchant in Reims. And so when she was 21 years old and her husband was not much older, they were married in a secret ceremony underground because it was the beginning of the French Revolution. And these 2 wealthy parents wanted to preserve their wealth by having 2 wealthy kids marry each other. So it was an arranged marriage. And they had a daughter, and throughout their early years of marriage, they traveled the Champagne district, and they met with grape growers and winemakers and purchased wine from the different grape growers there and brought it back to their Champagne house and blended the wine and bottled the wine. And then something horrible happened. Francois, her husband, died of typhoid. And she was 27 years old when this happened. She was a widow in France during the Revolution. Women were pretty much relegated to being childbearing housemakers, homemakers. And so she was very adamant that she did not want to give up the Champagne business that she and her husband had grown over the last 7 years of the marriage. So she pleaded with her father-in-law and begged him to let her remain in control of the Champagne house. So he gave her a 1-year period of time, but under the stipulation she would work with the winemaker. And she helped to make the wines much, much better. And she eventually became, the young widow eventually became the most recognized woman winemaker in the world. She was a pioneer. So at the time that wines were being made in Champagne, they were not this beautiful, sparkly, crystal clear wines that you have in your glass. Instead, they were real murky and not clear at all. And they had a lot of sediment in them. And the people that liked this kind of wine didn't like the sediment, of course. It was very sweet wine at the time. And so as she went on making wine, she decided that she was going to make her wine better. She wanted to get the sediments out of it. So she's quite creative. She came up with the idea. She noticed in the cellar that when the wines were on the side, aging, the sediments would cling to the inside of the bottle. And she then noticed if she stood it up, the sediments would fall to the bottom of the bottle. So she came up with an idea that she should invert the bottles and put them down, and that hopefully gravity would work. Well, how did she accomplish this? She accomplished this by getting a saw and putting holes in her kitchen table. And she put bottles of her wine in the holes in the kitchen table, and every once in a while she'd pick it up and shake it a little bit and put it back down. And sure enough, in about 2 months' time, the wine that was in this part of the bottle became clear, and all that dead yeast and sediment was settled into the neck. Well, how do you get the sediment out of the neck without turning it upright and ruining the appearance and the flavor of the wine? So she then knew that the thing to do would be to freeze the neck. So she came up with an idea again to create a very briny, icy, briny solution, and she would put the bottle neck into this ice, and it would freeze the sediment plug that was in the neck. Then they would be able to take off the closure. The plug, which was frozen, would shoot out of the bottle, but then you've got this much, not with wine in it. And so problem solved. The sediment plug was disgorged from the bottle, but what to do next? They'd lost a lot of the bubbles. You want to retain the bubbles in your champagne. Even though she didn't understand the science behind fermentation, she knew that yeast, new wine, that was still fermenting would make bubbles. So she created a solution called a dosage, a solution of new, fresh wine with some yeast in it, sugary wine with yeast in it, and she topped off the bottles with that little bit of sugary, fermenting new wine, and then sealed it up. And then 2 years later, voila, you have a sparkling wine that's clear. Her wine became so famous in Russia and in England that she became very, very wealthy and very well respected. By the time 2-3 years had rolled around, she had come up with another technique. You couldn't go around and put holes in all of your kitchen tables. So they came up with the idea of creating an A-frame rack with holes that were drilled at a 45-degree angle, and they would put the bottles of wine that were going through the first fermentation to get the yeast plug out, they would put them in what they called a riddling rack. This is a riddling rack. And they would be all over the cellars with these inverted bottles, and every other day, a wine riddler would go through the cellar, pick the bottle up slightly and turn it a quarter of a turn. Every 2 days, this happened for a 2-month period of time. And as that happened, the sediment would create the plug in the neck. So riddling racks are still used today in France. An experienced riddler can turn several thousand bottles a day. And you can see it online. They just, all this through the racks. They also have mechanical riddlers now, which really cuts down time. The reason why champagne is so cost prohibitive is because the big champagne houses are still doing everything by hand, but the ones that are not so big, they use mechanical means, and so it's just also the reputation of champagne is so high, they can charge the price, you know. People think that Dom Perignon was the first. The monks at Saint-Hilaire were the first. So you can pay $300 and something for this, or you can pay something like $15 or $20 and get something maybe not as good, but very, very, very good. Another thing that's important to know about champagne, why is this bottle of Canard Duchesne from the Champagne region of France, why is it $40? And why is the Veuve Clicquot $80? And why is the Dom $300? Well, the reason is because these wines here are non-vintage wines. And this Dom Perignon is always a vintage wine. And what that means is that this company, they have their cellars stocked with Pinot Meunier, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay wines that have been made in vintages all of the year. Vintage basically just means the year that the grapes were harvested. So in this Canard Duchesne, they possibly have lots of vats of Chardonnay from 2018, maybe they have Pinot Noir from 2016, maybe they have Pinot Meunier from 2020. And when they blend that wine together, they can't put on the label all of that information. So this becomes known as a non-vintage champagne. And you'll notice when you go into the store that it doesn't have any date on it. These wines over here do have dates on them, but this champagne, non-vintage. Veuve Clicquot has a number of wines. This is their entry-level wine. This is a non-vintage wine. It has no date on it. Dom Perignon, on the other hand, is always, always made in a vintage. And you'll notice when you go to buy a bottle that not only will it have the name, but it's going to have vintage 2010. That means in their warehouses, their cellars, they have vats of white Pinot Noir that is from 2010. They'll have Chardonnay wine that is from 2010, and they will have Pinot Meunier wine that is from 2010. And those three are blended. They're all from the same vintage. And so using wines from the same vintage means they're going to be more expensive. So now we're going to talk about the Old World and the New World wines. This might seem like a foreign concept to you, but it's really important. What I wanted to relay to you is that in this region of the world, which encompasses France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany, and in the regions of Armenia, that is the cradle of the wine, beginning of wine. There have been archaeological digs in these areas that have turned up amazing discoveries of wineries that have long since been buried. They've found huge cisterns and vats with wine residue and pips or seeds from the grapes. And they can date these things, carbon dating back to 6,000 years ago. So wine has its origins in ancient history. As a matter of fact, one of the first references that we have of wine written is in the Bible. And it talks about how after there was a flood, Noah's ark landed on a mountain in Turkey. And he brought with him, after he let the animals go, he brought with him vines. And he planted a vineyard and he made wine. So it goes back quite a while, and it's a very important part of life. If Noah thought to take the animals and the grapevines, that tells us a lot. Also in the Bible, it talks about Jesus' first miracle, and that first miracle was at a wedding in Canaan of Galilee, and the Bible records that he had big cisterns or jars of water brought to him, and he turned the water into wine on the seventh day of this wedding celebration. And the groom said to him, "Oh, you've saved the best wine for last." Now, I have no explanation of this. Maybe there was wine residue in those cisterns. Maybe when they added the water, it turned into wine. Or maybe it was a real miracle. But either way, the religions of the world have a lot of basis in wine. Not only was it referred to in the Old Testament with Noah, it was referred to in the New Testament with Jesus. And at the end of Jesus' life, at Passover, when they passed the bitter wine around, which was representative of the Israelites' captivity in Egypt, that bitter wine, he raised his glass during the Last Supper and he said to the effect that this is my blood that's shed for you. This is a symbol of me dying for you. And he also had bread, and so that's why communion is practiced today with bread and wine. The reason why I'm telling you all this is because the church is responsible for the spread of grapes, vineyards, and wines. Even in the United States during Prohibition in the 1930s, the only thing that was allowed to be made was wine for the sacraments. And so the Catholic Church actually kept a lot of wineries in business out in California. But this region right here is called the Old World. All the grapes that we have today and these great varieties of wine originated in this place. These grapes grew and flourished right between the 30th and 50th parallel from the equator. That's the grape growing region of the world. Eventually, in the 1800s, as the world was being populated, people in America began to take grapes and bring them over to the United States on the 30th and 50th parallel. It's the same as France and Italy. And they began to plant grapes in those regions, and they flourished just the same as they did in the Old World. But because these vineyards were only 100, 150 years old, they became known as New World wines. The United States is the New World to anybody that lived in Europe. Then, about 100 years ago, they caught on that down in the southern hemisphere, where our summer is their winter, they discovered that here's the equator, and on the 30th and 50th parallels of from the equator in the southern hemisphere is the same type of growing climate as it is in the northern hemisphere. And so winemakers began to plant vineyards in Chile and in Argentina and in Australia and in New Zealand. And what they did depending upon the landscape and the climate, is they planted the grapes that came from the old world and flourished in these types of regions, topographical, geographical, and they planted those grape varieties that were tried and true over here into different regions where those grapes would thrive the same way that they would in the old world. And so that's New World and Old World wines. If your wine on your label says that it's from France, Italy, Spain, Germany, those are Old World wines. They may be made with New World methods, but they originate in the Old World. Anything from the Southern Hemisphere, South Africa, New Zealand, all of those are referred to as New World wines, including Canada and the United States. Okay, so now we're going to talk about terroir. And terroir is a French word that talks about the earth, the climate, the geographical, topographical area that the grapes are grown in, the elevation of the wine vineyards, the way that the sun hits the wine, the microclimates around the vineyards. Terroir is a word that encompasses all of those things. And it actually means a sense of place. So the terroir that the grapes are grown has to do a lot with the flavors of the wine style, all of these things, the climate, the moisture, the sunshine, the earth, what the earth is made out of, whether it's rocky soil, chalky soil, clay soil, silt soil, all of those things play into the flavors that you get in your glass. Now, there are some naysayers out there that don't think terroir has much to do with the flavor and style of wines that we have, but they are misled because terroir is very important. And so we have some beautiful pictures here, and it shows different terroirs. One of them is Germany, and it shows sloped vineyards next to a river. One of them is from France, and it shows a side view of vines that are growing. There's a little bit of topsoil, and then you can see quartz and clay right underneath that. And then you have a vineyard that has fog rolling in over the vineyard. These are all graphic examples of different terroirs. Now, Old World wines are based greatly on terroir. The traditional winemakers of France and Italy want each glass of wine that you have to represent the growing region and the place where the grapes were grown and where the wine was made. A lot of wines in the New World are just mass-produced wines that do not reflect where they are grown. They might have different style variations, but your wines like Yellowtail or Forest Glen, these types of wines that are jug wines or boxed wines, they generally are not crafted in a way that that the wine reflects a particular region. So in the Old World, we have wines that actually come from, this is a Sancerre. We're going into Sauvignon Blanc now. And this is a Sauternes. And then we have some New World Sauvignon Blancs over here. As we taste these wines, the Sauvignon Blanc wine, you're going to learn a lot about the terroir of New Zealand, because what you have in your glass right now is a New Zealand wine. But we're going to do just a little bit of history on the terroir of these wines, and also we're going to talk about how to smell and taste the wine. So I'm going to have Terry talk about these two wines. This is a Sancerre from the Loire Valley. Sancerre is a little village. And this is a Sauterne from Bordeaux. And both of these wines are made from the Sauvignon Blanc grape. The one that we're tasting today is Overstone New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And Terry, would you tell us a little bit about this, where the grape originated and the second place it originated?
Yes, you'll see this Sancerre. Nowhere on that label does it say Sauvignon Blanc. The French just assume everybody knows that Sancerre must be Sauvignon Blanc. Of course, that's not true. Nobody knows it's Sauvignon Blanc, except the people of Sancerre. You have to look at the back label to find that out. But Sancerre is arguably the finest dry Sauvignon Blanc that is made. Here we have Carme de Riossec, Sauterne. This is made of Sauvignon Blanc and probably a couple of other grapes, but it is late harvested. Residual sugar is kept in the wine, and that is done by adding alcohol. It kills the yeasts and the bacteria so they can no longer ferment, and therefore the fermentation is stuck and you have residual sugar, sugar that does not get to ferment because the fermentation agents have been eliminated. Again, you do not have the name Sauvignon Blanc anywhere on this label, and I don't think you even have it on the back label of this particular one. But indeed, Sauvignon Blanc is a principal grape there. Overstone is a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. It says Sauvignon Blanc on the label, and that's to keep us consumers properly informed, which is probably good marketing. This is currently my house wine because it's a great buy, and I happen to like Sauvignon Blanc. With Sauvignon Blanc, you can taste the grapes. So much Chardonnay is oak aged that quite often the flavor of the grapes is not evident. You're tasting more oak than anything else. To me, that's not high quality, but many American consumers seem to crave that oaky flavor, so the wine industry makes wine for them because they're arguably majority of the people. That's not me. I want to taste Chardonnay grapes because that wine is made from Chardonnay, and I want to taste Sauvignon Blanc grapes because this wine is. There's no regional name here. It's our system to use the name of the grape. And again, that is much more explicit, and it's easier for Americans to deal with, to learn. You remember the days when most American red wines were called Burgundy? And many American white wines were called Chablis. Totally erroneous names which would be illegal in Europe. But we are stealing those names willy-nilly in those days. To take it a step further, the Gallo brothers, the largest wine producers in the world in their time, just in case you didn't know that Chablis was a white wine, they labeled theirs Chablis Blanc, hitting your head over the name on the label. But you can't fault the Gallo brothers because their Chablis Blanc, made from who knows what grapes, became the largest selling white wine in this country for a while. So they know what they were doing. Let them use whatever words they want on their labels. End of story.
Okay. All right, so Terry explained to us about the Sauterne, which is a Sauvignon Blanc wine that's made in Bordeaux region of France. It is a sweet dessert wine. It's delicious. It's like honey and tangerines. The reason why it tastes that way is because of the way that it was made and the way it reacted to the terroir. So in this region where the Sauterne is made, it's called Graves, the Graves. And so Graves is an area of Bordeaux that is very gravelly and has a lot of stone and a lot of limestone in it. And so it's called the gravel. It's like a gravel pit where the wines grow. The other thing that happens with Sauvignon Blanc wines that go into the sweet wines is something called noble rot. Did you ever have strawberries go bad in your refrigerator and they get that mold on them? Well, that is that mold is called botrytis. And what happens in the vineyards during late harvest, as Terry was saying, oftentimes the botrytis will attach itself to the grapes, the Sauvignon Blanc grapes in the vineyard. These are late harvest grapes, meaning that instead of being harvested in late August or early September, they're hanging on the vine in late September. And this botrytis mold will attach itself to the skins of the Sauvignon Blanc grape and bore tiny, tiny holes into the skin of the grape. Think about a window screen, how it's got all the little holes in the mesh. That's what happens to the grape skins during botrytis. They call botrytis noble rot because it creates an incredible wine. So these are actually noble rot grapes that go into Sauterne.
To carry Julie's analogy one step further, when those microscopic holes are made in the skins of the grape, it facilitates the evaporation of water from the grape juice through the skins. And what is left behind is the nectar that becomes a sweet wine. If that water was not allowed to evaporate through the skins because the botrytis was not working on the skins, then the fermentation would be complete, and you'd have the water content still in the wine, and you'd have a dry wine.
So this is from the Graves. This wine here is a Sancerre from the Loire Valley. The thing that's interesting about the terroir of the Graves and of the Loire Valley is that the whole western side of France was once covered by a shallow ocean. And as a result, there's a lot of limestone in the gravelly soil. And this limestone is the result of fossilized oyster shells and other sea creatures. And over the eons, it compacted into chalky soil. And so as the Sauvignon Blanc grapes and even Chardonnay grapes that are grown in these areas, they put their roots deep. Sometimes the roots can go 6 feet deep. And those roots draw in minerals from the terroir. And so Loire and Bordeaux have very similar terroirs. They're both on the western side of France, somewhat maritime. The Loire is a river valley that goes for over 300 miles west to east. And all along the way of the Loire Valley, there were wild grapes growing, flourishing. This is back in the 1300s and 1400s. And these wild green grapes turned out to get a name called Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon, basically when broken down, is 2 French words, sauvage, which means wild, and vin, which is vine. So the wild vines, and blanc is white. So the wild white vines, that's the grapes that this come from. So the name Sauvignon Blanc is related to the terroir, wild grapes growing along the river. And now, as Terry pointed out, this is our house wine at the time, and it is made in New Zealand, which is a New World wine region. Only the last 150 years or so have they started to plant grapes in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand's terroir includes 2 islands that are south of the equator, and those 2 islands have very different terroirs. The island, which is to the north, is closest to the equator, so those wines are fruitier, less acidic. They have a little bit more tropical flavor to them. The wines that are produced on the South Island have a couple of different factors that influence the way the wines taste. First of all, that southern island is divided from east to west by a huge mountain range called the Southern Alps. And the vineyards are planted in the shadow of those Alps to the east side, along the coast. And so, first of all, we have a cooler growing climate down on the South Island. We have the mountains, which certainly affects weather. We have the ocean on the eastern side, which makes it a maritime weather. We have very warm days there, sunny, bright, sunny days, and nights are incredibly cool. Furthermore, the regions where the best Sauvignon Blanc wines are made is called Marlborough. It's up on the eastern side of the South Island, and that is just chock full of gravel and stones and limestone. And what these New World winemakers have done, instead of trying to make the terroir speak loudly in the glass, they've put names on the labels that actually relate to terroir. For instance, this one is called Over Stone. That's because the vineyards are planted over stones. This one is called Oyster Bay because of the calcium deposits from fossilized oysters and the maritime climate of the bay. This one is called Cloudy Bay, and it has a picture on the front of it of fog rolling in. So fog plays a real big part in terroir. It just bathes the grapes in coolness and moisture. This one is from the United States, California. The name of this wine brand is called Bon Terra, and Bon is good and Terra is the earth, terracotta. So Bon Terra, good earth. And then we have one here that's called Frog's Leap, and Terry helped make this brand very famous overnight. This was a struggling winemaker in California who was just wondering if he was in the right business or not. And Terry got wind of this wine, and it was in the early 80s, and he wrote this article in the New York Times. And it's got the Frog's Leap logo on it, and the article was Frog's Leap, a prince of the California wine. And it's great because it talks about catchy and quaint names of the countryside reflecting the flavors in the wine. And he goes on to say things like how the frogs, live in the grassy areas. Grassiness is a big part of the aroma of Sauvignon Blancs. So his article appeared in the New York Times, and the day after it appeared in the New York Times, this company started getting inundated with telephone calls. And it was because of this article that they became famous. And now they are one of the most famous Sauvignon Blanc makers in California. Again, this wine, the Bon Terra and the Frog's Leap, are sustainably grown or biodynamically grown organic grapes. This is a big trend in wines right now. People are very concerned about what they consume. And so they will say on the labels made with organic grapes or sustainable or biodynamic. All right, so now we're going into our white wine tasting, and we're going to start with the Overstone Sauvignon Blanc from Marlborough in New Zealand. It's a New World wine. And we're going to be tasting the Sauvignon Blanc in the smaller glass. It is a very light colored wine. The first aspect of tasting will be looking at the wine. You want to look at the clarity of the wine. The second aspect of tasting will be to swirl the wine in the glass, just a little bit. Sauvignon Blanc is very, very aromatic, so you don't need a huge glass or to swirl it very much. What the swirling does is it forces the aroma to go up into the bowl. The third thing you want to do is smell it. Swirl it around again. Ah, it smells wonderfully fresh, doesn't it? And it will have these aromas and flavors of citrus fruit and lighter colored fruits. The next thing you do after smelling, what you're doing when you smell is you are preparing your brain to taste the wine. You want to sip the wine. It's kind of a three-part thing. Sip the wine, swish it around in your mouth, and then swallow it. So let's do that. Terry, what do you get in your nose and in your bowl?
I certainly get the greenness in the nose, what I call grassiness. And that's classic Sauvignon Blanc.
Did you notice when you tasted it, the way that it registers on your tongue and in your palate? Try not to drink all of it because we're going to compare it with the Chardonnay, but take another sip, and as you do and swish it in your mouth, be mindful now of if your mouth is watering, if it's puckering at all, and how brisk it is when you swallow it, and how long the flavor lasts in your mouth. And also, when you take that sip, you can breathe in a little bit while you do it too. So let's try that one more time. Is your mouth watering? That's because your saliva glands are kicking into overdrive to counteract the acids that are in this wine. The acids that are found in Sauvignon Blanc wines are citric acids. So we have lemony, lime, grapefruit, sometimes orange. We have these very bright, tart acids that react with our saliva glands. And the reason your mouth waters is because it's neutralizing that acidity, but it makes it feel so crisp and refreshing. After you swallow it, sometimes, as Terry said, there's grassiness. You'll notice on the very back of your tongue that registers bitterness mostly. It also will register some of those flavors like grassiness or a little bitterness from a lime or a lemon or especially grapefruit. So this is the characteristic of Sauvignon Blanc. It is light colored because it is only made in stainless steel vats in cold temperatures. It does not go into a barrel to age. It is cold fermented, which means that the acidity and the crispness and the fruitiness is preserved. And it's bottled and shipped out in a very short time after it's made. It maybe ages for a year. in the cellar. When they bottle it, New Zealand and Australia were the first wines that actually used screw caps. The French almost always now use cork. Once in a while you might find an inexpensive French bottle with a screw cap, but New Zealand and Australia were the leaders in screw cap.
New Zealand, in fact, passed a law saying that all of its wines must henceforth be in screw cap. That was several years ago.
So the different types of acids that are in white wines reflect white fruit flavors, white fruit acidity. And on your platters of fruit, you will see not only grapefruit and citrus fruits, but you will see other tropical fruits. There's mango and some pineapple. These are citric acids. You'll also see on your plate green apple and pear and peach and nectarine. Green apple is, you'll get some other types of apple in wines, but the green apple is the most important one. You know, when you bite into a Granny Smith apple, how crisp and mouth-watering it is? That's because malic acid is a part of green apples. That's what gives a green apple its flavor. Malic acid is a very important part of white wines. And there's another type of acid, it's called tartaric acid. It is what gives wine its tartness. That's easy to remember, tartaric. So tart is the tartaric acid. It's the most prevalent acid in wine. There are lots of different kind of fruits and vegetables that have tartaric acid, but in all the world, the fruit that has the most tartaric acid is the grape. So that's why we have tartaric acid that makes the wine feel tart. We have citric acid, we have malic acid, and then there's another type of acid, but it's not found in fruit. But it's a very important part of wine making. And now we're going to talk about Chardonnay and the fourth type of acid that is found in wines. This acid is called lactic acid, and it is the type of acid that's found in cheese and in butter and in cream. It gives wines a creamy texture, and it accentuates the flavor with aromas of butter, sometimes bread yeast. The reason that this is an important component of many wines is that it helps to soften the acids because it's creamy. And we're going to be tasting a Wente Chardonnay. This is from California. Now, this wine is made with grapes that were brought over from the Burgundy region of France. In the late 1800s, Karl Wente, who was a German immigrant, bought 47 acres in the Livermore Valley just east of San Francisco, on San Francisco Bay. It was basically about 30 miles from the ocean. He had learned how to make wine from a guy named Charles Krug, who was a famous Napa Valley winemaker. And once he learned how to make wine, he went out and he bought himself the land, and he decided that he was going to try to plant Chardonnay, which was not being made or grown in the United States. So he took a trip over to Burgundy, and he went to the vineyards, the white wine vineyards of Burgundy, and he secured clippings from the very best Burgundy grapes that he could find. He probably got them from the southern section of what's called the Côte de Beaune, which is where the famous wines of Meursault come from. Chablis is also the region where Chardonnay is grown. And I have some bottles here. This is a Premier Cru Chardonnay. It's a Chablis. Chablis wines are wines that are cold fermented, like the Sauvignon Blanc that we just tasted. They are very crisp and fruity, and they do not have lactic acid in them because of the winemaking technique. Furthermore, Chardonnays are in that same stretch of land where the terroir is very chalky. And as a result, the grapevines grow very deep into the earth, into the chalky soil, and they draw mineral flavors out of the terroir. These mineral flavors are reflected in Chablis in a great way. When you taste or smell a Chablis, you're going to smell aromas of green apples, bitter almond, lemon, and that's just about it. Once in a while you'll get you'll get the flinty mineral aspects of aroma as well from what it draws from the ground. But Chablis are crisp and refreshing, just like the Sauvignon Blanc that we just had is. Carl Wente went over to Burgundy and he got the best clippings of Chardonnay grapes he could find, brought them back to the Livermore Valley, grafted those clippings onto American grape rootstock, and started planting his own Chardonnay vineyards, the first ones in the nation. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, his Chardonnay wines were becoming so famous, his grapes were so wonderful, that other growers in California decided they wanted to make this wonderful Chardonnay wine as well. So they would go to the Wente vineyards and they would go right out into the vineyards. They're experienced grape growers. They would get their own clippings from those exact clones that were from Burgundy. Today, 80% of the Chardonnay wines, Chardonnay grapes that are planted in the vineyards of the United States are 80% Wente clones. Because of that, the Wente family is known as the first family of Chardonnay. So all of these California Chardonnays, almost all of these Chardonnays from California, have a direct connection to Burgundy and to the Wente clone. That's one of the reasons why I chose this Wente. Terry personally knew the Wentes quite well, and today it's the fifth generation of Wentes who are running the vineyard. And I love this Chardonnay because the Wentes made it in a way that is unique to a lot of the Chardonnays that we get in California. Half of the wine is vinified or made in cold fermentation only in stainless steel tanks. The other half of the wine that goes into the blend is Chardonnay that has gone through malolactic fermentation. Malolactic fermentation is a very important process. Malolactic fermentation is, in a sense, a secondary fermentation that takes place before the wine goes into the bottle. And it only happens when conditions are perfect. It happens when the freshly made wine is put into oak barrels to age. Now, these oak barrels are then put into the cellar to age for anywhere from a year to a year and a half. During that time, in the cellars, the temperature ranges around 68 to, 76 or so. During that time, while the wine is aging, any yeast, residual yeasts that are in the wine will sink down to the bottom of the barrel. And there's a little bacteria. Just like yeast is a single cell organism that creates the first fermentation, there's a little bacteria strain called Lactobacillus. And that bacteria eats malic acid. And that's the acid that's found in green apples, and that is a key acid in any white wines. So this little bacteria will consume the sharp malic acid, That's the acid that makes it so crisp. And as it metabolizes, it gives off lactic acid, which is the softer acid that's in milk. So for that reason, we have wines that are named after the process when they have gone through malolactic fermentation, and they end up with names like bread and butter, or just plain butter, because these wines have such a concentration of lactic acid in them. Once again, after the wines go through malolactic fermentation, which takes about 4 to 6 weeks, all of that acid that sharp acid has been converted into the softer acid. What the winemakers will do is, to add more creaminess to their wine, is they do a process called batonnage, where they will go in to the barrel through a little hole, and they will stir the dead yeast that's in the bottom of the barrel. And that will help the wine to have an additional creamy mouthfeel to it. So the malolactic fermentation is the process that turns the acid from malic acid to lactic acid, and it's very important in wines. It happens in the barrel. Another thing about the barrels are, not only do the barrels have wood flavors, the barrels also, if they're American oak barrels, have a high percentage of vanillins. And so oftentimes you'll end up with wines that have a distinct aroma of vanilla. And so things like layer cake come into the play. These wines will, there was one called buttercream a while back, Chardonnay. These are all indicative of the flavors in the wine. Now back to Wente. You've got it in your glass, the larger glass of the two. The first thing we want to do is look at the color. Now you'll notice that the color is a lot darker than the Sauvignon Blanc. Compare the two by holding them up, or if you can't, put them up against the white paper that you have in front of you, and you'll be able to look right through those wines and see the difference in color. The color in a glass of wine, the color is called the robe. And so this is beautiful, this pale straw, almost green colored Chardonnay. And this is made with 50% wine that has gone through malolactic fermentation, so it has the lactic acid flavors in it, the buttery flavors, and it's got 50% of the wine that's been cold fermented, so it's got the crisp, refreshing flavors of the green apple. And so we see a difference in the color. That's because it went into some oak aging, and color was drawn out of the barrels and put into the wine. Second thing that we're going to do is just swirl it around, and then look at the sides of the glass where the wine was swirled around in. Do you see the way that it's sticking to the side of the glass? That's kind of important. It's not really creating any rivulets right now, but this shows the viscosity of the wine, or how much body the wine might have. In this wine, it was very clean and refreshing, and this wine is called a light-bodied wine. It's very light in your mouth. This is going to be more toward a medium-bodied wine. The way I like to describe it is, imagine that you are tasting skim milk. There's hardly anything in skim milk. It doesn't coat your mouth with any type of feeling. It's very thin. Now think about tasting 2% fat milk. It's got more flavor, it's got more heaviness in the mouth, more weight. Now think about tasting half and half or whipping cream. That really coats your mouth. White wines are light to medium bodied mostly. If there were sugars in the wine, if there was a sweet wine like the Sauternes we saw, it would be clinging to the sides of the glass after you swirl it like this. This it just kind of hangs there, and then little droplets start to form. The Chardonnay has a heavier viscosity to it because of all the procedures that it's gone through to get into the glass. It's gone through malolactic fermentation. It has aged in the barrel and drawn flavors from the barrel. And if you did this and you observe it now, you'll start to see that these little tiny streams are starting to form and drip down in. Now those are called legs. Perhaps you've heard of wine legs before. These are referred to as legs around here in America. I like the Italian version better, which is the Arch of Tears. When we start tasting the red wines, you'll see these prominently, but it's important to look at them now. You can see this is taking quite a bit of time to form any type of little rivulet. So we're swirling it, we're looking at it, we see the color, we see the legs. That gives us a clue that it's a heavier bodied wine than the light one that we looked at. Now we're going to smell it. And what do you smell in the glass? Do you smell flavors of the green apple, of the pear? Swirling it like this causes the aromas to come up and fill the bowl. One of the ways I describe aroma is it's like a rose bud. When a rose is in bud form, you can sniff it all you want, but you're not going to get any flavor, any aroma out of it. It's only when the rosebud begins to open up like this that you get the beautiful floral scents. And this is what happens with wine. When you first pour it from the bottle, it's going to be very tight and closed up. But as you expose it to air and swirl it around like this, it causes that bouquet, perhaps you've heard of a wine's bouquet, it causes that bouquet to just flower and blossom. And so by doing this, we force all of those aromas into the bowl, and you're smelling it, and your brain is getting messages. Just from smelling this, I can pick up, to me most notably, is a bit of a creamy nuance. And then we get some pear and some green apple. Now we're going to put it in our mouth, and we're going to do the same thing with it that we did with the Sauvignon Blanc. We're going to take a sip, we're going to swish it all around in our mouth, we're going to swallow it. Pay attention to your mouth watering, to the texture or weight of it, and the way that it lingers on your palate after you've swallowed it. Wow, that's a mouthful. It's very juicy. My mouth is watering. It's also coating the back of my tongue and the center of my tongue. The center of our tongue is where we detect umami, which is a savory kind of sensation. In the finish, I can feel the acid on the sides of my tongue, in the back. I can detect a hint of almost a spiciness or cedar on the back palate. This is where you swallowed it. The length of the lingering in your mouth is called the finish. This has the qualities of this are juicy. My mouth is watering, but not overly. The texture of this is medium-bodied. It's not as bright and crisp as that. It lingers on the back palate. I can still taste it. It's got a medium finish. It's not going to stay in my palate and on my taste buds for 2 minutes, like some wines will. But my mouth is still watering from tasting that. Now what I want you to do is I want you to compare the two. This will give you a lesson in the body of the wine and the difference between the color. Much of this color in the Chardonnay is derived from the oak aging. And the freshness of the Sauvignon Blanc is because of cold fermentation. The little bit of creaminess, mouth coating feeling that you get in the body of this is due to the malolactic fermentation, creating lactic acid instead of just malic acid. So let's taste both of them side by side. First, the Sauvignon Blanc. Very limey to me right now, and even white grapefruit in the back. Now we're gonna taste the Chardonnay. Notice it's a little heavier in the mouth. It almost has peach flavors as it opens up. I'm getting a little peach in the back palate. It's juicy, but not so tart that it makes my mouth water like this one does. Why? Because the lactic acid is balancing out the citric, it's got lemon in it too, the citric and malic acids that are in this glass. So this glass of wine has all four of those acids in it. Tartaric acid makes it tart and juicy. Citric acid gives it that little briskness and flavors of lemon. Malic acid is going to give it the flavors of green apple. Tartaric acid is going to give it that tartness that it has. And the lactic acid, of course, complements all those flavors, tones them down, tones that acidity down so it's not so brisk. This is the kind of wine that you want to serve with white foods or light-colored foods. These Sauvignon Blancs go fantastic with shrimp, shellfish, scallops, pastas that are very light, and then the Chardonnay also with light cheeses. Some of the fruits, the things that are on the fruit platter are mirrored in the wine. So you wouldn't want to have this wine with a big juicy steak because it would conflict with the flavors. So white wines go with chicken, fish, shellfish, seafoods, pastas with cheese sauces. The acidity helps to counteract the butter and creaminess of things like macaroni and cheese or lobster or shrimp scampi that's in butter and garlic. So it's not exactly rocket science, but it does take a little bit of skill to realize what wines go best with what foods. On your plates, in front of you, you have some cheeses. The goat cheeses like feta and chèvre go wonderful with the Sauvignon Blanc. Those cheeses are very dry, and the Sauvignon Blanc complements them beautifully. The camembert and even the feta and the goat cheese and the cream cheese with salmon that's on your plates, that goes beautifully with the Chardonnay. And now we're going into talking about red wines, but first I'd like to share with you about proper preservation of wines that have been opened and aging, because these are important parts of, especially if you have a wine cellar. So first we're going to start off with this bottle of Chianti Classico. We'll be tasting this as our second wine. Now, if you're like us, sometimes you don't finish a bottle of wine at nighttime. You only want one glass with your meal, and you have a half a bottle left, and you don't want that wine to go bad. Overnight, if you just put a cork in it, it's going to start to deteriorate. It's going to oxidize from the oxygen that's in the bottle. It changes the flavor of the wine. And so we have a product that we use in our store when we did wine tastings, and we use it at home. And that is called Private Preserve. The gentleman that invented this, didn't invent it, but got the idea to put argon gas in a can and sell it to wine people was a genius. His name's Scott Farmer. Terry wrote about him back when he started his business and gave him some notoriety. In the winery, when they're making wine and they want to protect the aging wine from oxygen that would cause the flavors to go bad, they use this argon gas, which is a flavorless gas that is slightly heavier than oxygen. And what it does is it settles under the oxygen on the surface of the wine, protecting the wine surface from the oxygen, which would oxidize it. And this is genius. Private Preserve, when you get a can of this, it will have a little straw on the side of it. I have one open right here. You'll be getting a can of this with your wine, in your case of wine. What you want to do is take the straw. You've got a half a bottle of wine left. You're not going to drink it for 3 days. You want to preserve the flavor. So you take the little straw, you insert the little straw in that hole. See if I can do it. Then you've had your wine, you've got your cork or your screw cap, and what you're going to do is you're going to take the Private Preserve and the cork in hand, and you're going to do 1 short pump and 2 longer pumps, and you can't hear it in the can. It's silent, but it's in there. You'll hear it when it comes out. So you put this straw down into the bottle. You give it a short one and then 2 longer ones. You can see the wine bubbled right up there from the pressure. And then we put the cork in. And this wine will be good for a month or maybe more. We opened a bottle in our cellar a couple of years ago, and it was very tannic and just needed a lot more time. So we put this in it and tasted it then a while later, not too long ago, and it was just as good as no flavor changed. The second thing I want to talk to you about is aging. Now, this bottle is one of the most valuable bottles we've put our hands on. It is a bottle of 1966 Chateau Lafite Rothschild.
A Magnum bottle.
A Magnum bottle, double bottle. It is what's called a first growth Bordeaux from one of the most famous wineries in the world. And years ago, Terry and I did an inventory for an estate. The man had passed away, was leaving his estate to his children. He had a massive wine collection. We inventoried the collection, which was valued at about $80,000. And this wine was in that collection. We were responsible for finding a broker to buy the wine. We have a lot of friends in New York City, and we finally found someone who was willing to pay a pretty penny for that wine collection. And so the time came when he sent his people up from New York, and we went into the cellar, which was supposedly had been under lock and key, only to discover that somebody had taken the very finest wines from that cellar and put them on the floor upright behind the door. I know who did it. I know why he did it. He was hoping, he culled out the best wines. He was hoping that I would let his professor friend from Princeton buy those wines. He did not realize that by standing a bottle of wine upright that has a cork in it as a stopper, that the wine would not be in contact with the cork and the cork would dry out. The reason why you cellar wines with corks on its side is because you want to keep the cork wet. The cork will shrink and it will drop down into the bottle.
But not if it's kept wet.
But not if it's kept wet. This bottle was valued at about $5,000. In 1979, April of 1979, the fella bought it for $125. He has a piece of masking tape on it. So it had grown in value incredibly. So worth $5,000. The broker bought it for $2,000 because he was going to sell it. He was going to resell it. when he came up to get the wines, and all of these wines were behind the door on the floor, upright, the corks had dried up and fallen into the wine and were floating in the wine. And it was just like seeing the worst accident in the world for a wine person. And the cork is still down there floating in the wine if you tip it on the side. It is now a learning prop. $5,000 bottle of wine, worthless because the cork is floating in it.
Well, that's some valuable as vinegar.
Might have value as vinegar. It could still be a showcase piece in a cellar, but that's about it. So those are ways to preserve the flavor of your wine when you don't want to drink a whole bottle, and how to store your wine. And when the wine starts to evaporate, as it will naturally, even when it's on the side, it will shrink in the bottle. It'll dissipate some. Why? Because corks are porous and it allows for micro-oxygenation. And so as wines age in the bottle, they get better. And this one, you can see, used to be up to here, it's down to here. That term for that evaporation is called ullage. And so this is a Bordeaux bottle, and this is a Burgundy bottle. This is a Bordeaux bottle too. Look at the shapes of those two bottles. These are both old world wines, red wines, and the shapes carry over today into where the origin of the grapes were from. The Burgundy bottle has slope sides, and the Bordeaux bottle has shoulders. And so that's the way it was in the old country. So these days, winemakers around the world will put their Pinot Noirs, which are from Burgundy, into bottles with no shoulders, and their Bordeaux's will go into Bordeaux-shaped bottles that have this distinctive shoulder right there. Now, one of the reasons why it's important to age certain wines in the cellar is because there's so much structure in the red wines. With white wines, we just learned that acidity gives a white wine structure and the fruit flavors give it structure. But in red wine, there's a whole lot more going on. There's a compound that's in the skins of grapes that's called tannin, or tannic acid. Tannic acid originates in plant materials. You know the old Christmas song, "Oh Tannenbaum, oh Tannenbaum"? Tannenbaum. It's a tree that's tannic. You know about tanned leather. They use tannic acid to treat supple, soft cowhide, and it flushes out all the fats and all the impurities, and it causes the molecular structure of the leather, of the suede, to change, and those molecules of protein in that hide cross-link together like this. That's what makes leather durable. You could have a suede jacket and suede boots, but if you're riding a motorcycle, you want something leather that's hard and durable and is going to protect you if you wipe out. So tannins are a very important part of wine because they come from the red grape skins. Now, if you take a red grape and you chew it and chew it and chew it, first you're going to taste the flavor of the fruit and the juiciness of it. You might taste a little acidity, but it's very sweet. But after that's gone, continue to chew it until you're just down to the skins. And you're chewing, and you'll find that it becomes bitter. So let's do that. Juicy, delicious, sweet. During fermentation, that sweetness goes away. We're still chewing, and the flesh of the fruit is gone. You're still chewing, and the skins are starting to get very dry. And then you can feel as you're chewing, they start to get bitter. And chew a little bit more until it's really dry and really bitter in your mouth. And that bitterness from that dry skin is tannic acid, is tannin. So tannin is a compound that's found in plant material. It is in red grapes because of the skins. White wines are not aged on their skins during fermentation. During fermentation of a white wine, they will extract the juice from the grapes, pull the grape juice off, and then the rest is refuse. If a winemaker wants a little bit more structure or color in the white wine, he may leave the grape juice on the skins for anywhere from 5 hours to 2 days to get more flavor and structure. That's where the skins come in. You get your flavors and your structures from the skins. In red wine, all of these red grape varieties that we have get their flavor nuances, which are, as you see here, all red fruits and black fruits. They get their flavor structure and their tannins from the fruit and from the grape skins. When red wines are made, the grape skins are smashed all up with the seeds and the stems and the skins, and anywhere from 10 days to 14 days, that wine ferments, and as it ferments, it creates heat, and it's drawing all the color out of the grape skins and all of the flavors out of the grape skins. Each red wine variety has a different flavor profile. So we're going to go on to our our Pinot Noir grape now. And I'm just going to move these out of the way and show you, why do we age wine in the barrels for up to 2 years? And the reason is because of the sediment. Now, this is wine that we made about 3 years ago in wine school, and it's been aging in the cellar at the store, and it looks pretty horrible, doesn't it? Okay. It's half sediment, and just 1/8 of that sediment is dead yeast on the bottom. The dead yeast, by the way, has a name. It's called lees, L-E-E-S. So we have a layer of lees, and then we have a layer of sediments. Those sediments are tannins and other sediments and phenols and flavor compounds that fall out of the wine to help it to age. It causes the wine to be softer, but it's still very, very cloudy. The widow Clicquot wanted to figure out ways to get the cloudiness out, and she did by removing the sediment plug. That's why hers were upside down. Even white wines have sediment. In this case, we've got the lees or yeast on the bottom, the sediments, and then the clear liquid. How do they get that liquid to become clear? They have a process called fining, and it goes back hundreds of years. And basically what they do is they take egg whites, and they drop egg whites down into the barrels. And as this is going on, this aging is going on, and the egg whites are like a magnet for sediments. And so as the egg whites filter down through the wine and join this sediment at the bottom, it draws more and more sediment out until the wine is clear. Now, they've discovered also that they can use certain types of clays. So if you walk into a wine store and you see a label that says vegan wine, you will know that they did not use egg whites to fine the wine. They used a clay. So now we're going to move to Pinot Noir, which is my favorite red wine, and the red wine of Burgundy, France. As I was saying before, all the wines, red wines in Burgundy, in the Côte de Beaune, are Pinot Noir. The ones that are grown in the southern area of what's called the Côte de Beaune are softer red wines. The ones that grow in the colder region of what's called the Côte de Nuits are wines that have so much structure. They have a lot of acid, they have a lot of tannin, and those wines require a long time aging in order for the sediment to settle out of it, the tannins to settle down, and the acids to come more into balance. That's why we age wines, to make them drinkable. If you drink a red wine just out of, that's been bottled a year before, it's not going to taste very good. As a matter of fact, earlier we decanted the third and last red wine, Los Vascos. And the reason why is this wine is still young. It's only a 2018, and it's made out of Cabernet grapes, which are very thick-skinned and have a lot of tannin and a lot of acidity. And that wine is so abrasive, if you just drink it right out of the bottle into your glass, you won't enjoy it. So we opened it 2 or 3 hours ago to give it a chance to breathe. Now, Pinot Noir is the grape of Burgundy. It is called one of the noble red wine grapes. There are 18 grapes that are classified as noble grapes. 9 of them are whites and 9 of them are reds. Today we tasted 2 of the noble whites, Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc. Now we are going to go into tasting Pinot Noir, Sangiovese, and Cabernet. Those are 3 of the noble reds. There's still a whole lot of noble grapes that we have to taste again. So at this point in time, we've got 2 regions. This region right here is Pommard. And this is down in the lower section of that Burgundy region. It's a wonderful little area, not any bigger than, Keene, okay? Burgundy is like a patchwork quilt. The names of the wine on here, you will see it does not say anywhere on it Pinot Noir. As Terry said with the Sancerre in the Loire region, the wines in France are named after the region. So this is a Pommard, and Pommard is a wonderful grape that is fruity and delicious and with black cherry and aromas of violet and vanilla from the oak aging. It is a fabulous wine. This one retails for $75. And then we have Pinot Noir Bourgogne. This is a village in Burgundy. This is kind of like the generic wine. It just says Burgundy on it. And the winemakers decided that they weren't selling enough Burgundy, so they figured, let's educate the people so they know what they're drinking. And so they started to put the name of the varietal. So this one says Pinot Noir in large letters, but it also says Burgundy underneath it. So you know that it's a French wine from Burgundy. This is a Deloche wine, which we're going to be tasting today. Jean-Charles Boisset is the gentleman who now runs the Deloche empire out in California. He is a good friend of ours. His father, Jean-Claude Boisset, was one of the major negociants in Nuits-Saint-Georges, which is just over the border of the Burgundy capital. And this fella bought Burgundy wines from whoever wanted to make them and distributed them. That's what a negociant is. So his father had a rich history in the making of French wines and also into bringing them over to the United States. So back to the clone varieties that are in these wines, the grapes that go into the Deloche are from 2 different grape sources in France. One of those grapes, which is about 80% of it, is clippings or clones from the Pommard grapes in the Côte de Beaune. Pommard, excellent wine. The other part of the wines in this one, the other part of the grape variety, is called the Swan clone. It's named after a fellow with the last name Swan. And the story is that the Swan clone was smuggled out of the most prestigious Burgundian vineyard in the world, Domaine Romanée-Conti. And the Domaine Romanée-Conti Burgundies go for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Again, he's a friend of Terry's, and it's very cool to be able to taste his wines and know who he is. So this Deloche, originally the fella that started it, is directly from Burgundy. The grape clones, or the clippings, came directly from two of the most prestigious wine growing areas in Burgundy. So this is made in the Russian River Valley of Sonoma County in California by this Frenchman whose father was the first negociant. And the wine is very fruity. One of the things that we shared before was that in red wines in the old world, they tried to express terroir. And so the wines are not as fruity. But in the New World, in California and in Australia and any place else where they're growing this stuff, they make the wines in a much more fruit-forward style. So they're not as indicative of the terroir. They don't terroir. They don't have as much earthiness to them. Then I have two wines here that are important. Mark West is California Pinot Noir. This is the fella that put Pinot Noir on the map in California as being affordable. These wines, these Burgundy wines, are very, very expensive. And people couldn't afford to drink Burgundy, so Mark West decided, okay, I'll grow Pinot Noir and I'll make a Pinot Noir wine and I'll make it affordable. And it is, and it's pretty good. It's $14.99 a bottle. So finally, people are having a red Burgundy style wine at an affordable price. We have here a bottle of Old Vine Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley in Oregon. This one is called Highland Estates, a nod to the terroir, the highland.
Another bit of further refinement here, the term appellation contrôlée in France, the government-imposed regulation that limits your production to a certain amount of grapes per acre. And the reason for that is if you limit the production, you get a more concentrated wine because the grapes contain more concentrated fruit. The more the production is allowed to increase, the more those grapes expand, the blander they get, and the less quality the wine has. So the term appellation contrôlée is short for appellation contrôlée et limitée, limited. Now, if you're not trying to overproduce, but sometimes you do it because nature causes you to do it, and you still have to limit your production of the resulting wine to that same amount. That gives you excess you have to get rid of, and you're not allowed to call it by its appellation name. What you call that excess is just Pinot Noir. Even though a Burgundy wine labeled as just Pinot Noir might actually contain some Pommard in it, or some
Nuits Saint-Georges.
Nuits Saint-Georges, right. But you're not allowed to use those terms. So it's kind of a gamble to buy these wines simply labeled French Burgundies, labeled Bourgogne Pinot Noir. You never know what you're getting. You might get lucky. There could be some very fine Pinot Noir grapes in there. And I want to give you one other little nugget. There is a saying among wine lovers, sophisticated wine lovers, that the first obligation of a great wine is to be red. And the first obligation of a great red is to be Pinot Noir or Burgundy. And that's kind of a truism. As your sophistication grows over time, and you appreciate the nuances and the different levels of fruit and structure in red wines, you come to appreciate Pinot Noir more and more and more. When I say Pinot Noir more and more and more, I'm saying Burgundy basically, because it's the grape of Burgundy. You don't get quite that same complexity from California or Oregon Pinot Noirs because the vinification is different, and they don't allow the terroir to speak, as it were. California and Oregon and most American producers are looking for quick sales. They're looking for fruit forward. You, the wine amateur, they want you to taste the wine and say, I love this. Well, that means it's got to have a lot of fruit as soon as you taste it without aging. So it's a whole different concept. In France, Pinot Pommard or Louis Saint-Georges, everybody knows that they've got to be at least 12 or 15 years old before they're going to be good to drink. And no sophisticated wine lover in France would ever uncork one of those bottles before its time. And its time will not be until 12 or 15 years later. In this country, we don't want to wait that long. We want you, the consumer, to say, as soon as you go out to your local store and buy that wine and bring it home and pull the cork that night to have with dinner. It's got to have fruit forward. And to have fruit forward, you just have to have a totally different attitude about making the wine. Okay, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Terry. So you have a fruit platter of red and black fruits. The flavors that are going to be evident in Pinot Noir are red fruit and bright cherries and currants. So we've got some dried cherries and some currants. We have some strawberry and raspberries and some plum. And that's generally what you're going to find in a lighter wine like a Pinot Noir. This Pinot Noir, if you pick it up and look at it and swirl it around, it's a little bit lighter than the other ones that are in your glass. It has a beautiful robe or color. And as you do this, let's take a look at the sides of the glass and see if we're going to see some legs or arch of tears developing. Mine are starting now. And that means that the wine has more structure than the white wines did. That structure comes from tannins and from the coloring agents in the grapes. They're called phenols. And they cause the wine to have a medium to fuller body. So we have some beautiful legs starting to come here. Now we're going to do the 7 S's. We looked at it, we swirled it around. Now we're going to sniff it. Take a couple of deep sniffs. It smells so good. What does your brain say you're smelling? You know what I get right off the bat? I get a warmness, like a little bit of vanilla spiciness maybe, just little. Cherry and currant. And you might get something different. Your brain may be registering what you smell in your glass differently than what I do in mine, but the typical aromas and flavors of Pinot Noir are some violet or floral, vanilla, because it gets that from aging in oak, cherry, raspberry, strawberry, and currant. Now we're going to taste it. We're going to put it in our mouth and we're going to swish it. As you do, you're going to notice an added component to what's in your mouth. You're going to notice that you're going to start feeling a little dry on your cheeks. That's a result of the tannins that are your cheeks, the protein in your mouth is reacting to those tannins. And just the way the tannins shrunk the proteins in the animal hide to make leather, there's not enough tannin in this to do that to your cheeks, but you'll register a dryness and a texture. So we're going to taste it, swish it around, swallow it, and then pay attention to the acidity, which is their mouth watering, the tannic structure, which is the drying out of the sides of the cheeks, the body, which is, in a sense, the heaviness of the wine, and then the finish as you swallow it. Cheers.
As you swirl it around in your glass, by the way, that helps it to develop. And you'll notice the nose of the wine becoming more and more evident. The longer you swirl it, the longer you have it in your glass, which is why you see knowledgeable wine lovers constantly swirling their red wine as they're trying to focus and force out all those nuances that are hiding in there, but need exposure to air in order to emerge. And some of this all takes the place of aging to a certain extent, but it can't fully take the place of aging. So if you have a young wine, what's the vintage of this, Julie?
This is a 2018, I believe. 2018.
Yeah.
That's pretty new.
Yeah, so that's probably 3 years old next month. That's very young. And even for an American wine, a California wine, or an Oregon wine. And so it needs to be swirled around constantly like that. And don't be too fast to swallow this wine because it's just going to get better and better in the glass.
Terry even swirls his iced tea and his Coke because it's a matter of habit.
True.
Now, we don't want to drink all of this because we're going to compare it with the next wine. Now, look at the rivulets that are forming on the inside of your glass once you've swirled it around a couple of times. They come on pretty strong. All right, so we're going to put the Pinot Noir down for a minute. And we're going to move on to our second wine, which is a noble grape from the region of Tuscany in Italy. This grape is called Sangiovese. Literally, it means the blood of Jove. Jove was a Roman god, and Sangio means to bleed in Italian. And so because of the color of this wine, they thought it looked like the color of blood. They gave it that name centuries ago. Now this wine, Sangiovese, when it's young, it's going to have flavors of strawberry, tart cherry. You're not going to get as much currant as this as that. It has a different fruit profile. It will sometimes smell and even have a hint of tea in it. So this wine, Sangiovese, is the crown jewel of Tuscany, which is right on the front of the thigh over the knee of the Italian boot. And within that Tuscany region is a place called Chianti. And within the Chianti region, there is a place called Chianti Classico. Now you will notice if you look at this bottle on the back of it, it has the symbol of a black rooster inside of a little circle. And it says Chianti Classico, and it's got the date 1716 on it. Now, there's a story behind the Chianti Classico region, and it has to do with this black rooster. It is the legend of Gallo Nero. Gallo is the rooster, Nero is black. Back in medieval times, the city of Florence, which was in the north of the Tuscan region and the capital of Italy now, and the city of Siena, which is in the southern part of the Chianti region, they were warring over those those prime vineyard areas in Chianti. And it was a constant battle of who's going to control that wine growing region. So they came up with an idea that on a particular day, 2 knights would set off on their horses at the crowing of the cock, and the line where they met, the place where they met, would be the delineation line of those 2 winemaking regions, the Sienese and the Florentines. So on this bottle of just plain Chianti, we can see on the label a knight. That's very symbolic for the Chianti region in Tuscany. The Florentines choose a black rooster. The Sienese choose a white rooster. The Sienese pamper their rooster and feed it well and give it lots of fresh air and sunshine. The Florentines put their black rooster in a really dark chicken coop and don't feed it for a couple of days before the race. On the day of the race, before dawn, it was like the crowing of the cock at dawn. Before the dawn came and the sun rose, the Florentines took their black rooster out, and immediately that hungry, starving rooster started to crow. It may have been 3 in the morning, it may have been 4 in the morning. At any rate, the Florentine knight took off and rode and rode and rode. And of course, when dawn came and the white Sienese rooster began to crow, that knight took off, and they met 7 miles outside of Siena. And in that way, the Florentines acquired the region that's known today as Chianti Classico. Now, there is a consortium. It's actually called the League of Gallo Nero. And all wines that are made in that Chianti Classico region that's in the middle of Chianti have that black rooster on them. And what that indicates is that this wine is made in the old style tradition of the Chianti Classico region, which is the very best growing region for Sangiovese grapes. As we said before, in the old world, the names of the wines are directly related to the geography. And so while this is a Sangiovese grape, it's actually called a Chianti Classico from the Chianti Classico region. Now over here we have a Chianti Reserva. It's not a Classico. It was made in a different region. Reserva means the reserved wine.
It was made in the same region.
Same region, but also they reserve it in barrel a little bit longer. So this may be aged in a wooden cask for 6 months more. That's what the reserva designation is on there, even though it's within the Chianti region. And again, this is just a regular old Chianti, $7.99 a bottle. The wine that we're going to try today is what, $30 a bottle?
$17.99.
$17.99. It's by Banfi, who are good friends of ours, and that's why we chose it. So this wine also has a little bit of other grape varieties in it, Caniolo Nero and something else I don't remember right now. What we're going to do is the same thing we did before. We're going to look at the color and swirl it, see if those legs appear. The legs don't really mean anything except that there's structure and alcohol. The legs appear because of surface tension in the glass. The alcohol evaporates very quickly. So when you do this, the alcohol that's in the wine evaporates, and that causes a gap in the surface. And so the tension, that surface tension, causes little rivulets to form and come down back into the wine via what they call arch of tears or legs. One time we went to dinner with my daughter-in-law and a friend, and the friend was so sweet. and I just love her. And we gave her the wine, and she goes like this, and she goes, "Wow, look at those arms." So, I have huge rivulets coming down, huge arch of tears here. And that's because there's a little bit more alcohol in this. It's probably 14.5%. It's on your spec sheet anyway. The alcohol, as it evaporates, creates the legs. We're going to taste it now and do it a mindful tasting like we just did. Smell it a couple of times, put it in your mouth, swish it.
First, I want to tell you a little bit about politics there. The way that the Chianti Classico Consortium financed itself and its ability to enforce the regulations and hire a staff and so forth was by imposing a tax on the producers. And the largest producers paid the most tax because the tax was per bottle of wine produced. And as a result of that, a couple of the largest producers said, hey, we're financing the whole consortium with our revenues because we're paying more taxes. So they decided to drop out of the Chianti Classico Consortium. And in so doing, they no longer had to pay that tax. They no longer were financing their competitors, and they can't use the name anymore. But if your name is Antinori, you don't need the name.
Right, right. Some absolutely incredible Sangiovese grapes are grown outside the regions. Brunello is one of them, Brunello di Montalcino. You've seen, that's a Sangiovese grape. Anyway, it's wonderful. What you're going to notice when you taste this, you're going to notice bright acidity. It's going to be young, but it's going to be far more tannic, causing your mouth to dry up when you taste it. So give it a good swish and swallow. My mouth is puckering. How about yours? It's drying. So much more than the Pinot Noir. Let's compare the two now. American Pinot Noir, much fruitier, much more gentle on the mouth. The Sangiovese, a little bit more acidity and very tannic. Why is that a good thing? Because this is going to go great with your red wine, or your red pasta sauces, and the hard cheeses, and the hard cheeses, the salami, and the pepperoni. And you also have some Parmesan on your plate as well. The wines in Italy are made for the foods in Italy, and the foods in Italy are made for the wines. If you're having a dinner party and you're making Italian, drink Italian with it. If you're making French cuisine, go for a French wine or a wine that has its roots in France. So that is our Chianti session. And now we're going to go to the last wine, which is a Cabernet. We decanted it 2 hours ago in order to let it breathe, and hoping that the fruit aromas would come forward and that the tannins and the acidity would calm down a little bit. It's not like the tannins and acidity go away when you swirl your wine or decant your wine. What it is that the fruit aromas bloom and blossom in the glass, thereby complementing and balancing out the tannic structure and the acidity. So Cabernet is going to have flavors of prune, blueberry, blackberry, black cherry, black raspberry. It's also going to have maybe some nuances of vanilla. And here we have some baking spices here. It takes a while for Cabernet to age and become drinkable. While it's in the barrels, it often picks up vanilla and baking spices. So here we have some allspice, some nutmeg, and some cinnamon. Also, another interesting point is two noble grapes in France got together back in the 1700s. One of them was Sauvignon Blanc, which we just tasted, and the other one is Cabernet Franc. Now, Sauvignon Blanc grew in the southwestern part of Bordeaux, and Cabernet Franc grew smack dab in the middle. And somehow, some way, in the 1700s, there was a cross-pollination that took place. So Cabernet Franc became the father, and Sauvignon Blanc became the mother. Thus the name Cabernet Sauvignon. It is a marriage of those two grapes, and this is its baby. As a result, you're going to pick up a little bit of greenness, grassiness sometimes in this wine, if it doesn't age long enough. And depending on the terroir, you could also get some of those hints in this as well. Now this grape, Cabernet, thick skin equals a lot of tannin. Dark skin equals a lot of color. So if you open it up, pick it up and look at it, you'll see it is much darker than the Sangiovese and the Pinot Noir. Those have thinner skins than the Cabernet. The flavors are going to be markedly different. So, and the legs are going to be different too. You'll swirl this around and you'll see that the legs appear pretty quickly. Now this wine is from Chile. And why do we choose a Chilean Cabernet Sauvignon? I will tell you, because of the roots it has in Bordeaux. Cabernet Sauvignon, as we just learned, originated on the left bank of Bordeaux. And one of the major makers of the red wines in Bordeaux was Mouton Rothschild. They're one of the 5 most important first growth wines of Bordeaux. And Mouton Rothschild decided that they would purchase vineyard land in Chile. And so they sent their French winemaker with their French wine grapes, and they went over to Chile and they started planting vineyards of their French grapes over there. And now they've lent their name, of course, because they're famous, to this bottle. It's called Chromis. This is a 2018, and it's going to have a lot of the flavors of the one from France, but it's also going to be very tannic, and you're going to find it doesn't have as much fruit because it hasn't had time in aging for those tannins to settle down. That's why we decanted it. So let's do the tasting. I get blackberry. Do you remember boysenberry or elderberry? I get that in here. It may taste abrasive when you get it in your mouth, but hopefully it's aged enough, opened up enough. And very, very tight legs, or arch of tears. And we taste it. We swallow it. Your mouth dries out and your mouth waters, right? If you have a well-balanced wine that has equal complementary parts of acidity, fruit flavors, and tannin, you'll have a rounded mouthfeel, well-rounded mouthfeel. You'll be hitting all of those important key parts of your mouth. This wine, if you taste it again, you'll notice after you swallow it that the most prevalent characteristic in it is tannin. My gums are dry. The top of my teeth are dry. and that's because there's so much tannin in that Cabernet. It would take another 8 to 10 years for this wine to fully mature so that the tannins settle out of it. As the tannins and the acids settle down, the fruit flavors come up and will make it well-rounded. But you'll notice it's not well-rounded. It has good acidity, because your mouth is watering, but it has way too much tannin. So what do you do if you've got a wine like this, a big wine with too much tannin? You pair it with a nice steak. It's got a good amount of fat in it, because just as when they tan leather, the tannins in the glass are going to wash away all of the fat in your mouth that you get from eating fatty foods. And so this wine, even though it's very young and needs to age longer in the cellar, this wine, you can drink it today if you decant it in the afternoon and you have it with dinner tonight, because it needs that breathing time to open up the aromas and bring them forward, so it at least balances out the tannins and the acids. And now let's taste this in comparison to the Sangiovese. Sangiovese tannins are a little gritty. Think about tannins like cornmeal. If you pulverize something into a fine powder, it's nice and smooth. It's almost like silt. If you have like a corn flour, that's going to be very, very smooth. If you have cornmeal, that's going to be bigger. The texture is going to be different in your mouth. Tannins can be fine and supple, and they can be coarse and abrasive. The tannins in the Pinot Noir, pretty well balanced with the fruit. That's a California style. In the Sauvignon Blanc, the tannins overpower everything, and they are aggressive, gritty, chewy tannins. And in the Sangiovese, they're pretty rough too. So,
But if you go back in a reverse order and taste your Pinot Noir now, you see why Pinot Noir can be so much more attractive to drink at a young age.
yes. And that concludes our wine tasting, our educational wine tasting. Thank you very much for coming. We hope you've learned a lot and had good fun. Thank you.